When rancher Nathaniel Cross desperately needs a wife to secure his inheritance, he makes an unprecedented deal at the women's prison, bail out a convicted horse thief to be his bride. But the gentle woman who emerges isn't the hardened criminal he expected. As she demonstrates an almost mystical connection with his untameable stallion, he begins to question everything about her conviction. In a world where men's reputations are built on assumptions and women's voices are silenced, sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the truth. It's discovering you've been living a lie. Will love be enough to overcome deception, or will the shadows of the past destroy their chance at redemption? She's not the criminal I expected. The Jailbird Bride. The mountain wind cut through the Colorado territory like a blade through leather, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. Nathaniel Cross stood at the edge of his property, watching the sun bleed crimson across the peaks that had guarded his family's land for 3 generations. In 6 weeks, it would all be gone. The letter crinkled in his weathered hands as he read it for the 100th time. His grandfather's will, as ironclad as the man himself, had been demanded marriage by Nathaniel's 33rd birthday. No wife, no inheritance. No inheritance, no ranch. Simple as a bullet to the heart and just as final. Maldita sea, came Maria Santos's voice behind him, her Spanish curse carrying the weight of a woman who had watched this family for 20 years. You're going to wear a hole in that paper, mijo. Nathaniel didn't turn around. Maria had been his father's housekeeper, his mother's replacement, and his own conscience when needed. At 60, she was the only woman in Colorado territory who dared speak to him with such familiarity. 23 rejections, Maria. His voice carried the exhaustion of a man who had spent weeks swallowing his pride. 23 respectable women who won't even consider a cross for a husband. Because of the stories about your father. Because they think our money came from cattle rustling and claim jumping. Nathaniel folded the letter and tucked it into his vest pocket next to his heart where it felt like a stone. Doesn't matter that we've run honest cattle for 30 years. Doesn't matter that Papa built this place with his bare hands and honest sweat. Maria stepped beside him, her small frame dwarfed by his 6'2" height, but her presence as solid as the mountains themselves. There are other women, Nathaniel. Perhaps in Denver or even back east. No time. He finally turned and Maria saw the desperation he'd been hiding behind his stoic mask. I leave for town in an hour. I'm going to do something that would make Papa turn over in his grave. The ride in a broken creek took 40 minutes on his bay-gelding Thunder. The town squatted in the valley like a collection of wooden boxes someone had scattered and forgotten to arrange. The territorial prison sat on the hill above it, a stone monument to society's failures, and Nathaniel found himself staring at it as he tied Thunder to the hitching post outside Sheriff Morrison's office. The sheriff, a thick-set man with graying whiskers and eyes that had seen too much, looked up from his desk with surprise when Nathaniel entered. Nathaniel Cross, don't see you in town much these days. Morrison's tone was neutral professional. Unlike many in Broken Creek, he'd never quite believed the stories about the Cross family. I need to see your records, Sheriff. The women's prison records. Morrison's bushy eyebrows rose toward his hairline. That's an unusual request. Might I ask why? Nathaniel removed his hat, running his fingers through dark hair that had grown too long. I need a wife, Sheriff, and it seems the only women in this territory willing to consider marriage to a Cross are the ones who don't have a choice in the matter. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Morrison set down his pen and studied Nathaniel's face, searching for signs of madness or desperation. He found both. Son, you can't be serious. Dead serious. I'll post bail, provide employment and marriage if she's willing. In exchange, she gets her freedom and a chance at a new life. It's more than she's got now. Morrison stood his chair, creaking in protest. Nathaniel, these women are criminals. Horse thieves, confidence artists, worse. You don't know what you're asking for. I'm asking for a chance to save my ranch and maybe give someone else a chance at redemption. Nathaniel's voice carried the steel of a man who had made his decision. Will you help me or not? 20 minutes later, Nathaniel found himself walking through the women's section of the territorial prison, his boots echoing off stone walls that seemed to absorb hope itself. The warden, a skeletal man named Peterson, led him past cells that held the dregs of frontier society. We got 3 eligible for what you are proposing. Peterson said, his voice carrying the mechanical tone of a woman who had long ago stopped seeing prisoners as people. Sarah McKinnon in for cutting a man who tried to force himself on her. Strong as an ox but mean as a rattler when riled. They stopped at a cell where a red-haired woman with arms like tree branches glared at them through the bars. Her eyes held the kind of wildness that spoke of too many years living rough. Then there's Clara Bell. Peterson moved to the next cell where a blonde woman in her 30s sat on her cot staring at nothing. Confidence games, mostly some theft. Smart as a whip, but can't be trusted further than you can throw her. The woman didn't even look up when they stopped. Her fingers moved constantly as if counting invisible coins or cards. And finally, Peterson said, stopping at the last cell, Evelyn Harper. Nathaniel looked through the bars and felt his world tilt slightly off its axis. The woman sitting on the narrow cot was nothing like what he had expected. Her auburn hair was clean and neatly braided, her dress prison-issued, but somehow worn with a dignity that defied her circumstances. When she looked up, her green eyes held intelligence, sadness, and something else, a kind of resigned grace that spoke of education and breeding. Miss Harper, Peterson said with the tone of a man announcing livestock, this gentleman might be interested in posting your bail. Evelyn Harper stood slowly, her movements controlled and careful. She was tall for a woman, perhaps 5'7", with the kind of posture that spoke of dance lessons and deportment classes. When she spoke, her voice carried the cultured accent of Boston's better neighborhoods. I'm afraid there's been some mistake, sir. I have no family or friends with the means to post bail. Nathaniel found himself staring, trying to reconcile this elegant woman with the horse thief and assault conviction Peterson had described. There's no mistake, Miss Harper. I'm Nathaniel Cross, and I'm prepared to post your bail in exchange for employment at my ranch. Something flickered in her green eyes. Hope, perhaps, or maybe suspicion. And what manner of employment would that be, Mr. Cross? Housework, cooking, general ranch duties. He hesitated, then plunged ahead. And if you're willing marriage, I need a wife, Miss Harper, and you need your freedom. It seems we might be able to help each other. The silence that followed was profound enough to hear dust settling. Evelyn's hands, Nathaniel noticed, were soft despite her months of imprisonment, with long fingers that spoke of piano lessons rather than hard labor. She studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to read a man's character in a single glance. What crime am I supposed to have committed, Mr. Cross? I assume you've been told. Horse theft and assault. The words felt wrong coming out of his mouth. But frankly, Miss Harper, I'm beginning to wonder if the territory made a mistake. A bitter smile touched her lips. How perceptive of you. Yes, Mr. Cross, the territory made a mistake. The question is whether you are prepared to risk your reputation on the word of a convicted criminal. Nathaniel looked at this woman who carried herself like a lady, despite wearing prisoner's clothes, who spoke with the education of someone born to privilege, despite being locked in a stone cage, and made a decision that would change everything. Yes, Miss Harper, I believe I am. The paperwork took 2 hours. Nathaniel paid bail that represented nearly a quarter of his remaining savings, signed documents that made him responsible for Evelyn's behavior, and found himself wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. As they walked out of the prison together, the afternoon sun painting the mountains gold and purple, he realized he knew absolutely nothing about the woman walking beside him except that she was convicted of crimes he couldn't reconcile with her demeanor. Evelyn Harper breathed free air for the first time in 8 months, and Nathaniel watched her face transform. The careful mask of prison survival fell away, replaced by something vulnerable and achingly beautiful. She closed her eyes and tilted her face toward the sun, and for a moment she looked like a woman who had been drowning and suddenly found the surface. Mr. Cross, she said, finally opening her eyes to meet his, I want you to understand something before we proceed. I am innocent of the crimes for which I was convicted, but I also understand that my word means nothing in this territory and that you are taking an enormous risk. If you wish to reconsider, I will understand completely. Nathaniel studied her face, noting the way shadows pulled in the hollow of her throat, the way her hands trembled slightly, despite her controlled voice. This close, he could see that her green eyes held flecks of gold, and that there were small lines around them that spoke of laughter in some distant past. Miss Harper, I don't know if you're innocent or guilty. What I know is that I need a wife in 6 weeks, and you need a chance at a new life. If you're willing to work hard and treat my ranch with respect, The rest will sort itself out. They rode back to Cross Creek Ranch as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and promise. Evelyn rode Maria's mare in gentle chestnut named Dulcie, with the easy grace of someone comfortable around horses. She didn't speak much during the journey, but Nathaniel caught her studying the landscape with the attention of someone seeing beauty after months of stone walls. "It's magnificent," she said finally as they crested the hill that revealed the ranch spread out below them. "Your family built all this?" "My grandfather started it, my father expanded it, and I'm about to lose it if I don't marry in 6 weeks." The honesty surprised him. He hadn't meant to reveal so much. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, studying the house that would either be her home or her prison, depending on how the next 6 weeks unfolded. "And if we marry Mr. Cross, what exactly would you expect from such an arrangement?" It was the question he had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. "Respect, Miss Harper. Hard work. Honesty if you can manage it. As for the rest," he gestured vaguely, his face coloring slightly, "we're both adults. We'll figure it out as we go." As they approached the house, a magnificent black stallion thundered across the far pasture main, flowing like dark water, powerful muscles rippling beneath a coat that seemed to absorb moonlight. The horse moved with the dangerous grace of something that had never been truly tamed, and Nathaniel watched Evelyn's reaction with interest. Instead of fear, her face showed fascination and something that looked almost like recognition. "He's beautiful," she breathed, "and angry. That's Tempest, my father's last acquisition before he died. Nobody's been able to break him. He's injured 3 men and destroyed 2 corrals. I keep telling myself I should sell him, but—" Nathaniel trailed off, realizing he was revealing more vulnerability than intended. "But you see your father in him," Evelyn finished softly. "The wildness, the refusal to be conquered. And selling him would feel like giving up on something your father believed in." Nathaniel stared at her, startled by her insight. "How did you know that?" "Because I understand what it means to be judged as dangerous when you're really just afraid." Her voice carried a weight of experience that made Nathaniel want to ask questions he wasn't sure he was ready to hear answered. Maria emerged from the house as they dismounted, her dark eyes taking in Evelyn with the shrewd assessment of a woman who had spent her life judging character. The two women looked at each other across the dusty yard, and something passed between them. Not friendship, not yet, but a kind of understanding. "Maria Santos," Nathaniel said, "Ostadini, this is Evelyn Harper. She'll be staying with us, helping around the ranch." "Welcome, mija," Maria said carefully. "Are you hungry? I have stew keeping warm." As they walked toward the house, Evelyn stumbled slightly, and Nathaniel realized she was exhausted. 8 months in prison, followed by the emotional strain of sudden freedom and an uncertain future, had taken their toll. Without thinking, he steadied her with a hand on her elbow and felt her tense at the contact. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "It's been a long day." "No need to apologize. We'll get you settled, fed, and you can rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out the details." But as they entered the warmth of the ranch house with its stone fireplace and solid wooden furniture built to last generations, Nathaniel found himself wondering if any of them would survive the next 6 weeks intact. He had gambled everything on a woman he didn't know, couldn't trust, and was beginning to find dangerously compelling. Outside, Tempest screamed his rage at the mountains, and somehow Nathaniel thought the sound perfectly captured his own emotional state. Wild, untamed, and heading towards something that could either break him or set him free. The first night, Evelyn Harper cried herself to sleep in the small room off of the kitchen that had once belonged to Maria's daughter. But her tears weren't for herself. They were for the man who had risked everything to save a stranger, and for the terrible secret that might destroy them both before love had a chance to bloom. In his own room, Nathaniel lay awake, listening to the wind howl through the pines and wondering if he had just saved his ranch or signed its death warrant. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, and the beginning of something neither of them could yet imagine. The game was in motion now, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Love, truth, redemption, and survival, all balanced on the edge of a blade, waiting to see which way fate would tip the scales. Morning came to Cross Creek Ranch with the sharp clarity that only mountain air could provide. Nathaniel woke before dawn, as was his habit, and found the house already filled with the scent of coffee and bacon. Through his bedroom window, he could see Maria and Evelyn working together in the kitchen, their movements synchronizing with the easy rhythm of women who understood each other without words. But it was what he saw through the kitchen window that made him forget about breakfast entirely. Evelyn stood at the corral fence perfectly still, watching Tempest pace the far end like a caged thunderstorm. The stallion's black coat gleamed in the early light, every muscle defined with the terrible beauty of barely contained power. 3 men had tried to break him. 3 men had been carried away bleeding, and yet Evelyn showed no fear. Nathaniel dressed quickly and stepped out onto the porch, keeping his movements slow and quiet. He had learned to read horses the way most men read books, and what he saw developing in that corral defied everything he thought he knew about animal behavior. Evelyn had begun to hum, not loud enough to startle, but clear enough to carry across the morning air. It was something classical complex, the kind of melody that spoke of conservatory training and drawing room performances. Tempest's ears swiveled toward the sound, his pacing slowing to a restless trot. "Mija," Maria's voice came softly from behind Nathaniel. "She has been there for an hour. That horse, he has not taken his eyes off her." "Has she said anything about her experience with horses?" "Only that her father was a veterinarian in Boston. She knows things, Nathaniel. Watch her hands." Nathaniel looked more carefully and saw what Maria meant. Evelyn's hands rested on the top rail of the fence, but her fingers moved in subtle patterns, complex, purposeful gestures that seemed to mirror the rhythm of her humming. It was like watching someone conduct an orchestra where the only musician was a half-wild stallion, and somehow, impossibly, the music was working. Tempest had stopped pacing entirely now. He stood in the center of the corral, head high, ears forward, focused on Evelyn with an intensity that would have been dangerous in any other context. But this wasn't dominance or aggression. This was something Nathaniel had never seen before, genuine curiosity from an animal that had never shown interest in anything human. "She's going to get herself killed," Nathaniel muttered, starting toward the corral. "No," Maria caught his arm with surprising strength. "Watch, really watch." Evelyn had begun to move, stepping away from the fence, with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. She walked to the gate of the corral, not the main gate, but the smaller one used for feeding, and stood there without moving to open it. Just stood, humming that complex melody, her hands now still at her sides. Tempest took a step toward her, then another. His neck was arched, his stance alert, but not aggressive, and Nathaniel realized he was seeing something that shouldn't have been possible. The horse was approaching a human being out of choice rather than necessity, curiosity rather than hunger. "How is she doing that?" Nathaniel whispered. "The same way she knew about your father last night," Maria replied. "She sees things, mijo, feels things. That woman has suffered, and suffering teaches you to recognize it in others." When Tempest reached the gate, he stopped just out of reach, close enough to touch if he stretched his neck far enough away to escape if he chose. Evelyn continued her humming, but she also began to speak, her voice so low that Nathaniel could barely make out the words. "I know," she was saying, "I know what it's like to be caged. I know what it's like to have everyone expect the worst from you, to be judged for things you never did. I know what it's like to be angry at a world that sees you as dangerous simply because you refuse to be broken." Tempest's ears flicked forward and back as if he was trying to understand not just the words, but the emotion behind them. His dark eyes never left Evelyn's face, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, his head began to lower. "They think you're untrainable," Evelyn continued, her voice carrying the soft certainty of absolute truth. "They think you're dangerous. They want to break your spirit because they're afraid of your strength, but I see what you really are. You're not dangerous, you're just tired of being hurt." And then, in a moment that would replay in Nathaniel's memory for years to come, Tempest extended his neck and gently touched his muzzle to Evelyn's outstretched hand. The contact lasted only seconds before the stallion pulled back, snorting and tossing his head as if embarrassed by his own vulnerability. But the connection had been made, and everyone present understood they had witnessed something extraordinary. "Dios mío," Maria breathed. "In all my years." Nathaniel found himself walking toward the corral without conscious decision, drawn by a mixture of admiration and concern. Evelyn turned at the sound of his approach, and he saw that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I know I shouldn't have. I just couldn't help myself. He's so beautiful and so angry." "Don't apologize." Nathaniel's voice was rough with emotions he couldn't quite name. "I've never seen him respond to anyone like that. How did you know what to do?" Evelyn looked back at Tempest, who had retreated to the far side of the corral, but continued to watch them with those intelligent, dark eyes. My father taught me that animals are honest in ways people often aren't. They respond to what you actually feel, not what you pretend to feel. Tempest isn't mean or vicious. He's been hurt probably repeatedly, and he's learned that humans bring pain. So I tried to show him that I understood. And do you understand what it's like to be falsely judged? The question hung in the morning air between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to address directly. Evelyn's hand tightened on the fence rail, and for a moment Nathaniel thought she might tell him everything. The truth about her conviction, the real reason she had been in that prison cell. Instead, she smiled sadly and said, "I think we all do, Mr. Cross. The only difference is whether we let it make us bitter or teach us compassion." They worked together for the rest of the morning, and Nathaniel found himself constantly surprised by Evelyn's competence. She helped Maria with the washing, demonstrating knowledge of which plants made the best soap and how to treat different types of stains. She assisted with the cooking, revealing familiarity with herbs and spices that went far beyond frontier basics. When one of the ranch hands brought in a mare with a cut on her leg, Evelyn examined the wound with the practiced eye of someone who had done such things many times before. "Clean cut, not too deep," she pronounced gently, running her hands along the mare's leg. "It needs stitches, but it should heal well if we keep it clean and dry." "You know veterinary medicine?" asked Tom Hendricks, Nathaniel's foreman, a grizzled man who had worked for the Cross family for 15 years. "My father was a veterinarian in Boston. I learned by watching and helping." Evelyn's voice was matter-of-fact, but Nathaniel caught the slight catch that suggested painful memories. "I have some experience with both large and small animals." As she cleaned and stitched the mare's wound with gentle efficiency, Nathaniel found himself studying her hands again. They were soft, yes, but now he could see the small scars that spoke of years spent handling animals. Bite marks from fractious horses, claw marks from frightened cats, the calluses that came from holding surgical instruments for hours at a time. "Miss Harper," he said as she finished bandaging the wound, "exactly what crime were you supposed to have committed?" Evelyn's hands stilled on the bandage, and for a moment the only sound was the mare's contented snuffling. When she looked up, her green eyes held the kind of pain that comes from betrayal by trusted authorities. "Horse theft and assault, as you were told. According to the prosecution, I stole 3 horses from my employer in Denver and attacked a stable hand who tried to stop me. The witnesses were very convincing. The evidence seemed clear, and I was a stranger in town with no one to vouch for my character. And the truth? The truth, Mr. Cross, is that I discovered my employer was running a sophisticated horse theft operation using forged papers and altered brands to sell stolen animals to buyers throughout the territory. When I threatened to expose him, he made sure I was the one who ended up in prison." The statement hung between them like a challenge. Nathaniel studied her face, looking for signs of deception, but found only the weary honesty of someone who had given up hope of being believed. "Can you prove it?" "The evidence is back east in a safe deposit box in Boston. Letters, photographs of the forged documents, witness statements from people who worked for him before me. But getting to Boston from a territorial prison was somewhat beyond my means." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Nathaniel found himself drawn into the most honest conversation he had experienced in years. Evelyn asked about his father, about the ranch's history, about his dreams for the future. In return, she shared carefully edited stories of her childhood in Boston, her father's medical practice, the slow decline of the family's fortunes that had driven her west in search of employment. "Your mother," she said gently as they watched Tempest graze peacefully in the moonlit pasture. "Tom mentioned she left when you were young. That must have been difficult." Nathaniel's hands tightened on his coffee cup. It wasn't a topic he discussed with anyone, not even Maria. "She said ranch life was too harsh, too isolated. Said she needed civilization culture, the things Colorado couldn't provide. I came home from school one day and found a note saying she had gone back to St. Louis. And you blamed yourself." It wasn't a question, and the gentle certainty in Evelyn's voice told him she understood from personal experience what such abandonment could do to a child. "I was 12. Of course, I blamed myself. If I had been a better son, if I had somehow made her happier." "She was wrong to leave that way," Evelyn said firmly. Whatever her reasons, abandoning a child without explanation is cruel. But her choices don't reflect on your worth, Nathaniel. They reflect on her character. The use of his first name sent warmth spreading through his chest. All day she had maintained formal distance, calling him Mr. Cross despite his suggestions that she use his given name. This small intimacy felt like a gift, a sign that perhaps she was beginning to trust him. "What about you?" he asked. "What drove you from Boston to Colorado Territory?" Evelyn was quiet for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old grief. "My father died suddenly. His heart. The practice was heavily mortgaged, and when the creditors came, we discovered he had been treating poor patients for free for years. My mother and I lost everything. She went to live with her sister in Chicago, but She paused, staring out at the darkened mountains. "I wanted to start over completely. Colorado seemed like a place where a woman might create her own future. Instead, you found prison. Instead, I learned that sometimes the very thing you're trying to escape follows you across a continent." Her laugh held no humor. "But perhaps that was necessary. Perhaps I needed to lose everything, including my freedom, to understand what really matters." "And what really matters, Evelyn?" The question came out more intimate than he had intended, loaded with implications about the future they might or might not build together. She turned to look at him, then her green eyes luminous in the moonlight. "Truth, Nathaniel, honesty, the courage to see people as they really are, rather than as their reputations suggest. The wisdom to know that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is trust someone completely, and the grace to do it anyway." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Nathaniel found himself leaning slightly toward her, drawn by something deeper than physical attraction. This was recognition, the sense that he had found someone who understood not just his words, but the silences between them. But before either could speak, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the intimacy. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, and Nathaniel's hand instinctively moved to the gun at his hip as he recognized the lead horse. Nathaniel Cross. The voice was cultured, confident, buzzing with the slight accent of someone educated back east. "I'm Thomas Whitmore. I believe you have something that belongs to me." The man who dismounted was tall and well-dressed, with the kind of face that suggested both intelligence and arrogance. His companions remained mounted hands, resting casually near their weapons in the manner of professional hired guns. Beside him, Nathaniel felt Evelyn go rigid with fear. When he glanced at her, her face had gone pale as moonlight, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the porch railing. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious terror, "I wasn't aware you were in Colorado Territory." "Business brings me here, my dear Evelyn. The same business that led to your unfortunate incarceration." Whitmore's smile was the kind that never reached the eyes. "When I heard you had been liberated from territorial custody, I felt obligated to ensure your safe return to proper authorities." Nathaniel stood slowly, placing himself slightly between Evelyn and the mounted men. "Miss Harper is under my custody, legally posted and properly documented. If you have an issue with her status, you'll need to take it up with the territorial court." "Oh, but I'm afraid it's more complicated than that, Mr. Cross." Whitmore reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. "You see, there's been new evidence in Miss Harper's case. Evidence that suggests her crimes were more extensive than originally believed. The territorial governor has issued a warrant for her immediate return to custody pending a new trial." Evelyn's sharp intake of breath told Nathaniel that this was unexpected, a development that terrified her more than Whitmore's mere presence. "What evidence?" she asked, though her voice suggested she already feared the answer. "Horse theft is a hanging offense in this territory when the value exceeds $50, as you well know. We've discovered that the horses you stole were worth considerably more than initially assessed. Prize breeding stock, some of them. The territorial court wants to reassess your case." The threat was clear. Whitmore had found a way to escalate the charges to capital offenses, making Evelyn's situation far more desperate than a simple horse theft conviction. In the moonlight, Nathaniel could see the calculation in the man's eyes, the smug satisfaction of someone who held all the cards. However, Whitmore continued, his tone becoming almost conversational. "I'm a reasonable man. I'm prepared to speak to the authorities, perhaps suggest that the new evidence might be questionable. in exchange for Miss Harper's voluntary return to my employ. Under proper supervision, of course. The meaning was unmistakable. Whitmore wanted Evelyn back under his control, probably to ensure she could never testify against his criminal operation, and he was prepared to use the threat of execution to force her compliance. "Over my dead body," Nathaniel said quietly, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "That can be arranged," replied one of Whitmore's companions, a lean man with dead eyes and quick hands. "But it doesn't have to be. Just hand over the woman and we'll be on our way." Nathaniel felt Evelyn's hand touch his shoulder, not clinging, not desperate, but steady and somehow giving him strength rather than asking for it. In that touch, he understood that she was prepared to face whatever came, but that she trusted him to make the right choice. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never backed down from a fight, "you're on my land threatening a woman under my protection. I suggest you leave now before this situation becomes more complicated than any of us want." Whitmore studied Nathaniel's face in the moonlight, clearly reassessing his original assumptions about the rancher's determination. "You would risk everything for a convicted criminal. Mr. Cross, your ranch, your reputation, your life." "I would risk everything for justice, Mr. Whitmore. And from where I sit, justice is what Miss Harper has been denied." The standoff stretched into tense silence, broken only by the wind in the pines and the distant sound of Tempest moving restlessly in his corral. Finally, Whitmore remounted his horse, but his expression promised this was far from over. "3 days, Mr. Cross. I'll give you 3 days to reconsider your position. After that, I'll return with proper territorial authority and ensure cooperation will no longer be optional." As the three riders disappeared into the darkness, Nathaniel turned to find Evelyn watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude certainly, but also something that looked like wonder, as if she had just witnessed something she hadn't believed possible. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "You don't owe me anything, Nathaniel. And now you've made an enemy of a very dangerous man." "I made a choice, Evelyn. The same choice I'd make again tomorrow." He reached out and gently touched her hand where it still rested on his shoulder. "The question is, what are we going to do about Whitmore?" "We." The word seemed to surprise her. "We. If you're innocent, then you deserve justice. If Whitmore is running a criminal operation, then he needs to be stopped. And if he thinks he can threaten a woman under my protection—" Nathaniel's voice carried the steel of a man who had found something worth fighting for. "Well, he's about to learn what happens when you cross across." As they stood together on the porch, united against the threat that would test everything they were building together, neither could have imagined how much deeper the conspiracy ran or how much more they would risk before truth finally emerged from the shadows. The real game was just beginning. 3 days passed like the countdown to an execution. Nathaniel spent the time preparing his defenses and gathering intelligence, while Evelyn threw herself into ranch work with the desperate energy of someone trying to build a lifetime of memories in the space of hours. But it was her continued work with Tempest that provided the breakthrough neither of them had expected. On the morning of the third day, as dawn painted the mountains in shades of rose and gold, Evelyn achieved something that 3 experienced horsebreakers had deemed impossible. She put a saddle on Tempest's back. Nathaniel watched from the porch as she moved through the corral with the fluid grace of someone who understood that training a horse was more like conducting a symphony than winning a war. Every gesture was purposeful. Every movement calculated to build trust rather than establish dominance. She had been working with the stallion for hours each day, gradually introducing the concepts of harness bit and saddle until they became familiar rather than threatening. "Easy, beautiful one," she murmured, her voice carrying the same melodic quality that had first captured Tempest's attention. "Just like we practiced. Nothing but trust between us." The stallion stood perfectly still as she placed the saddle blanket across his back. His dark eyes focused on her face with an intensity that spoke of complete attention. When she lifted the saddle itself, he tensed momentarily, but her gentle humming and steady hands kept him calm. "Incredible," breathed Tom Hendricks, who had joined Nathaniel to witness what everyone had believed impossible. "That horse threw me into a fence post just looking at a saddle 2 months ago." But it wasn't just the successful saddling that made Nathaniel's breath catch. As Evelyn adjusted the cinch, he noticed something that changed everything. A distinctive brand on Tempest's left shoulder, partially hidden by his thick winter coat, but clearly visible now in the early morning light. The brand was a complex design, the letter W overlaid with what looked like a merchant's scale, executed with the kind of precise craftsmanship that suggested official documentation and valuable bloodlines. Nathaniel had seen similar brands on the prize horses displayed at the Denver livestock auctions, the kind of animals worth hundreds rather than dozens of dollars. "Ton," he said quietly, "look at that brand. Have you seen it before?" The foreman squinted at the marking, then straightened with sudden recognition. "That's Whitmore's mark. Thomas Whitmore, the horse dealer from Denver. But how would your father have gotten one of his animals?" The pieces began falling into place with crystalline clarity. If Tempest bore Whitmore's brand, and if Whitmore was indeed running a horse theft operation, then the stallion was either stolen property or evidence of the very crimes Evelyn had been convicted of witnessing. Either way, the horse's presence on Cross Creek Ranch created a connection that could either damn them all or provide the proof they needed. "Evelyn," Nathaniel called, trying to keep the urgency from his voice. "Can you bring Tempest over here? I need to examine his brand more carefully." She led the now saddled stallion to the fence with the easy confidence of someone who had earned his complete trust. This close, the brand was unmistakable. Complex, professionally executed, and clearly indicating substantial value and documented ownership. "That's Whitmore's mark," Evelyn said, her voice heavy with implications she was clearly still working through. "But if Tempest was stolen from Whitmore, why hasn't he demanded return of the horse? A stallion of this quality would be worth a fortune." "Because," Nathaniel said, his mind racing through possibilities, "Tempest wasn't stolen from Whitmore. He was stolen by Whitmore, and the brand was either forged or altered to indicate ownership transfer." Evelyn's green eyes widened as she understood. "The horse theft operation I discovered wasn't just about selling stolen animals. It was about stealing valuable breeding stock and altering their documentation to show legitimate purchase. Tempest isn't evidence of Whitmore's ownership. He's evidence of Whitmore's crimes." Before either could say more, the sound of approaching riders announced Whitmore's return. But this time he hadn't come with just 2 hired guns. 6 mounted men emerged from the tree line, and the lead rider wore the badge of a territorial deputy. Mr. Cross called Deputy Marshal James Crawford, a man Nathaniel knew and generally respected. "I'm here to serve a warrant for the arrest of Evelyn Harper on charges of grand theft and assault with intent to commit murder. The territorial governor has also issued an order for the seizure of any stolen property on your ranch." Whitmore rode slightly behind the deputy, his face showing the kind of satisfaction that comes from bureaucratic victory. "I'm afraid Miss Harper's situation has become quite serious, Mr. Cross. The new evidence suggests her crimes were part of a larger conspiracy involving multiple thefts across several territories." "What new evidence?" Nathaniel demanded, though he already suspected the answer involved manufactured documentation and bought testimony. "Witness statements, bills of sale correspondence between Miss Harper and known criminals operating throughout the region." Crawford's voice carried the reluctance of a man following orders he didn't entirely believe. "I'm sorry, Nathaniel, but the documentation seems solid. I have to take her in." Evelyn stepped forward with the dignity of someone who had always known this moment would come. "Deputy Crawford, before you arrest me, I believe you should examine the horse I've been working with. I think you'll find it quite interesting." "What about the horse?" Crawford dismounted, clearly puzzled by the direction the conversation had taken. "The brand, deputy. Look at the brand and then ask Mr. Whitmore to explain how a horse bearing his mark came to be on Cross Creek Ranch." Crawford examined Tempest's brand with the careful attention of a man who had investigated enough livestock theft to recognize suspicious circumstances when he saw them. The complexity of the marking combined with its professional execution immediately raised questions. "Mr. Whitmore," Crawford said slowly, "this appears to be your brand. Are you claiming this horse was stolen from you?" For the first time since his arrival, Whitmore appeared uncertain. "That horse was legally sold to Nathan Cross's father over a year ago. I have the documentation." "Then you should be able to produce a bill of sale showing legitimate transfer of ownership," Evelyn said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who finally held the winning cards. "Along with documentation of the horse's breeding history, previous ownership, and registration with the Territorial Livestock Commission." Whitmore's hesitation was all the confirmation anyone needed. In the territorial system, valuable breeding stock required extensive documentation to prove legitimate ownership, and those records were maintained by multiple authorities specifically to prevent horse theft. If Whitmore couldn't produce proper documentation, it suggested the horse had been acquired through illegal means. Deputy Nathaniel said, "I propose a simple test. Send a telegram to the Territorial Livestock Commission in Denver. Ask them for the registration records of this horse. If Mr. Whitmore's documentation matches their records, then the horse is legitimately his. If not, then we have evidence of a much larger criminal operation." Crawford finished, his expression darkening as he began to understand the scope of what he was investigating. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to need to see all your documentation for this animal immediately." The next few hours unfolded with the inexorable logic of a well-constructed trap finally springing shut. Whitmore's documentation, when examined carefully, revealed subtle inconsistencies. Dates that didn't align, signatures that varied slightly, official seals that were close but not quite accurate reproductions of legitimate territorial markings. More damaging was the testimony that began emerging once Crawford started asking the right questions. Tom Hendricks remembered that Nathaniel's father had been asking unusual questions about horse theft in the weeks before his death. Maria recalled receiving strange visitors who had asked about the ranch's livestock records. Even the local veterinarian had noticed unusual patterns in the horses being brought through the territory, but it was Evelyn's careful examination of Tempest himself that provided the final piece of evidence. Hidden beneath the stallion's thick winter coat, she discovered a second brand, older, partially obscured by the more recent marking, but still visible to someone who knew what to look for. "This is the original brand," she explained to Crawford as she gently parted Tempest's coat to reveal the underlying mark. "Someone altered it, adding elements to make it appear to be Whitmore's mark. But the original registration would show this horse's true ownership and breeding history." The telegram from Denver arrived that evening, and its contents were devastating to Whitmore's case. The horse known as Tempest was registered as Thunder's Pride, stolen from a breeding ranch in Kansas 2 years earlier. The original owner had been told the horse was dead, killed in a barn fire that destroyed the ranch's records. In reality, the horse had been stolen, transported to Colorado Territory, and his brand altered to facilitate a legal sale. Moreover, the Territorial Livestock Commission had been investigating reports of systematic horse theft throughout the region, following a pattern that now clearly pointed to Whitmore's operation. Evelyn's original accusations, dismissed at the time as the desperate lies of a caught criminal, aligned perfectly with evidence the authorities had been gathering for months. "Miss Harper," the Crawford said, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of vindication, "it appears you have been the victim of a grave miscarriage of justice. The charges against you are hereby dismissed, and warrants will be issued for the arrest of Thomas Whitmore and his associates on charges of horse theft, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." Whitmore made one last desperate play, reaching for his gun as if he could shoot his way out of the truth. But Nathaniel was faster, his Colt clearing leather with the smooth confidence of a man who had never backed down from a fight. The two hired guns found themselves facing not just Nathaniel, but Tom Hendricks and 2 other ranch hands who had emerged from strategic positions around the house. "Don't make this worse than it already is, Whitmore," Nathaniel said quietly. "You've lost. Accept it with whatever dignity you have left." As Crawford placed Whitmore in custody, the man who had orchestrated Evelyn's imprisonment turned to her with the venom of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed. "You think you've won. You think this changes anything. You're still nothing but a convicted criminal in the eyes of decent society. No one will believe you, no one will trust you, and no one will ever forget what you were accused of." It was Evelyn's response that revealed how much she had changed during her time at Cross Creek Ranch. Instead of the defensive anger Whitmore expected, she smiled with the serene confidence of someone who had found something worth more than public approval. "You're wrong, Thomas. I've found someone who sees me as I really am, rather than as my reputation suggests. I've found people who judge actions rather than accusations. And I've learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is trust someone completely. And the most liberating thing you can do is discover that they've chosen to trust you in return." That evening, after Crawford and his prisoners had departed for Denver, Nathaniel and Evelyn sat on the porch where their journey had begun. The crisis was over, Evelyn's innocence had been proven, and the ranch was safe. But the resolution of external threats had only made their internal situation more complex. So, Nathaniel said, his voice carefully neutral, "You're free now, completely free. You could go anywhere, do anything, return to Boston, start over somewhere new, build whatever life you choose." Evelyn was quiet for a long time, watching Tempest graze peacefully in the moonlit pasture. The stallion, who had once been wild with rage and fear, now moved with the contented calm of an animal that had found his place in the world. "Do you want me to leave, Nathaniel?" "That's not what I asked. But it's what you're afraid of, isn't it? That now that I have choices again, I'll choose to leave, just like your mother did." The directness of her insight took his breath away. "Maybe." "Nathaniel Cross," she said, turning to face him with eyes that seemed to hold all the warmth of the mountain sunrise. "I was trapped in that prison for 8 months. I was trapped in that courtroom by leased and manufactured evidence. I was trapped in a life that had been stolen from me by people who valued their own interests over the truth. But sitting here with you on this ranch that you're fighting so hard to preserve, this is the first time in years that I've felt truly free. Why would I leave the place where I discovered what freedom actually means? And what does freedom mean to you, Evelyn?" "Freedom means being seen and valued for who I really am, rather than who others think I should be. Freedom means working alongside someone whose respect I've earned and whose trust I've proven myself worthy of. Freedom means building something together that neither of us could create alone." Nathaniel reached out and took her hand, marveling at the softness that had somehow retained its gentleness, despite everything she had endured. "I have a confession to make, Evelyn. The marriage requirement in my grandfather's will, it isn't just about inheritance. The lawyer told me yesterday that the will was a test designed to ensure I would choose love and justice over convenience and greed. The ranch would have been mine regardless, but only if I proved I was worthy of it." Evelyn's eyes widened slightly. "You mean you didn't actually need to marry me to keep the ranch?" "No, but I need to marry you to keep myself." The words came out more vulnerable than he had intended, loaded with the honesty of a man who had finally found something worth risking everything to keep. "I love you, Evelyn Harper. Not because you're convenient, not because you're available, but because you're the strongest, kindest, most extraordinary woman I've ever known. And if you'll have me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of your trust." Her answer came not in words, but in the way she leaned toward him, her free hand reaching up to touch his face with the reverence of someone who had finally found her way home. When their lips met, it was with the gentle intensity of two people who understood that some things are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth building a life around. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes, Nathaniel Cross, I'll marry you. Not because I have to, not because it's convenient, but because I love you too. Because you saw me when everyone else saw only my reputation. Because you trusted me when I couldn't even trust myself. Because you're the kind of man who risks everything for justice, even when it would be easier to look the other way." They were married 2 weeks later in a ceremony that drew every honest rancher, respected merchant, and decent family from 50 miles around. The ceremony was officiated by the circuit preacher, witnessed by Maria Santos and Tom Hendricks, and celebrated with the kind of frontier feast that would be remembered for years to come. But perhaps the most remarkable moment came when Evelyn walked down the makeshift aisle to meet Nathaniel at the altar. She rode Tempest, the stallion who had once been wild with rage, now moving with the stately grace of an animal that had found peace through trust and patience. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Sometimes the most beautiful transformations come through love rather than force, understanding rather than dominance. As they exchanged vows in the shadow of the mountains that had guarded Cross Creek Ranch for generations, both Nathaniel and Evelyn understood they were promising more than just love and fidelity. They were vowing to see each other clearly, to trust completely despite the risks, and to build something together that honored both their individual strengths and their shared commitment to justice and truth. The ranch prospered in the years that followed. Nathaniel's honest cattle operation expanded, but it was Evelyn's establishment of a veterinary practice that truly transformed their corner of Colorado territory. Word spread quickly that the woman who could gentle the wildest horse also possessed medical knowledge that could save valuable livestock, and soon ranchers from across the region were bringing their animals to Cross Creek Ranch. More importantly, their marriage became a partnership in every sense of the word. Together, they worked to expose and prosecute the remaining members of Whitmore's horse theft operation. Together, they advocated for prison reform and support for wrongly convicted prisoners. Together, they built a home where strength was measured by compassion rather than force, where trust was earned through actions rather than demanded through authority. And on quiet evenings, when the day's work was done and the mountains stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, they would sit on their porch and watch tempest graze peacefully in the moonlight. A living reminder that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is trust someone completely, and sometimes it's exactly that trust that sets you free. The ranch that had almost been lost was now more than saved. It had become a sanctuary for anyone who understood that true strength comes not from never falling down, but from having the courage to get back up and the wisdom to help others do the same. Their story became legend in Colorado territory, told around frontier fires and in ranch house kitchens for generations to come. It was the story of a man who risked everything for justice, a woman who never stopped believing in redemption, and a love that proved stronger than fear, more powerful than prejudice, and more enduring than any prison walls could ever be. In the end, they had both found what they had been searching for without knowing it. Not just love, but the kind of partnership that makes two people more together than they could ever be apart. And in a land where survival often depended on the strength of your walls, they had built something even better. A home where walls existed not to keep people out, but to shelter the kind of love that makes any place worth defending. The jailbird bride had found her freedom. The desperate rancher had found his purpose. And together they had discovered that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the most impossible circumstances. Love, it turned out, was indeed enough. Not because it made everything easy, but because it made the hard things worth fighting for. In a world where a woman's word means nothing and a man's reputation is everything, can love survive the truth? And what happens when the evidence they need to prove her innocence comes from the very horse that started it all? This sweeping Western romance explores themes of redemption, justice, and the courage required to trust completely. Set against the stunning backdrop of 1884 Colorado territory, it's a story of two broken souls who discover that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is believe in someone, and sometimes it's exactly what sets you free. Subscribe for more epic Western romance stories.